So my name is FHLATHARTA. I'm a researcher with the Centre for Disability Law and Policy, and along with the Irish Penal Reform Trust, we've just carried out research into the experiences of prisoners with disabilities in Ireland. We've looked very much at the legislative framework and the human rights framework, but also have been in prison. So it was commissioned by the IPRT with funding from IREC, which is great, because this is very much both been talking about the UK context a lot all morning. We don't necessarily have the same basis of research or the same knowledge of what's going on within the Irish prison setting. So over the course, we're so grateful for actually the access that we got and the cooperation of the Irish Prison Service, and in particular the 3 prison settings we interviewed and the prison staff who were there, who were excellent, in particular the 16 prisoners with disabilities that we interviewed, who and as well as that, the stakeholders across the criminal justice system who are working in and alongside it, alongside our actual disability advocates who kind of provided, I suppose, a lived experience perspective from outside of the criminal justice system. So the research wasn't specific to neurodiverse prisoners, although we did interview neurodiverse prisoners. We actually used the human rights conception of disability as conceptualised within Article 1 of the CRPD, the UN Convention, which basically says persons with disabilities include those who have long-term physical, mental and intellectual or sensory impairments, which in interaction with various barriers may hinder their full and effective participation in society on an equal basis with others, which is without question the most heavily negotiated definition of disability that has ever existed in the world, but it works very well. So the human rights framework, there's actually a significant number of human rights frameworks which do apply to prisoners with disabilities or people with disabilities in detention. The Declaration of Human Rights, the European Court of Human Rights, the ICCPR, the Convention Against Torture. We have the Prisoners' Rights Framework, which is a non-binding human rights instrument, which I'm not going to get into, or no one will get lunch, which is the Mandela Rules. Guess what they're named after. We also have the Disability Rights Framework, which is the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, which Ireland was the last nation in Europe to ratify last year, one of the last in the world, somehow managed to not ratify it fully. And that's very much grounded in equality and non-discrimination, accessibility and reasonable accommodation as kind of the core provisions to ensure equality for people with disabilities. The committee, the UN committee specifically, has been very clear that this applies to people with disabilities in detention, and have raised kind of globally within the reporting process the concerns that they have about people with disabilities in detention, and that again is across disability. Then we have another human rights framework, the European Court of Human Rights, the European Convention on Human Rights, which is very relevant to Ireland, given that it comes up a lot. Several cases involving people with disabilities in criminal detention settings in prisons have come up in front of the European Court of Human Rights. The Russia case found that basically a lack of accessibility for a disabled prisoner in that instance actually amounted to a violation of Article 3, which is provision against torture and cruel, inhuman and degrading treatment. The same thing happened with Price the UK, although there was a significant gender element in that case. That was in a woman's prison, and it was very much felt that her privacy wasn't being respected, partly due to the accommodations that were there, the failure to provide an accessible prison, an accessible cell, an accessible restroom. And in GB Poland, it was seen to be inhuman and degrading treatment because an inmate had to rely on his fellow inmates for mobility and sanitation. And this is something that we did see here as well, that a huge amount of support people with disabilities actually receive in prison is it comes from fellow inmates on a very informal level, which is both kind of heartbreaking and actually quite heartening. So yeah, Irish prisons, governed by the Prison Act of 2007, we actually have less than 4,000. It was 4,384 last week, people in prison. I like that we can get updated on a regular basis. You can actually get that in every jurisdiction. Most people in prison in Ireland are serving less than 1 year. We're governed by the Prison Act, which gives effect to the statutory instrument, which is the Prison Rules of 2007. Broadly rooted in the Mandela Standards. If you actually get into the specifics, the Mandela Standards are more progressive when it comes to disability, but I digress. The rules also foresee transfer to specific facilities for disabled people, This is a quote from one of the prison staff we were working with. I think one of the big issues with prison is if you don't fall within the norm of being an 18 to 30-year-old able-bodied male, and even using that term in itself I know is not ideal, but if you don't fall within that sort of norm, prison is going to be a challenge for you. And so I'm going to talk a bit about the barriers that people were facing. I should also state that prisons are also subject to a lot of the same equality provisions that the rest of the other public institutions are subject to, including the IREC Act and the Public Sector Duty, which I can't explain right now. But the Irish Prison Service has actually been very engaged with their public sector duty in terms of gender, but haven't done so with regards to disability, even though both are equally protected. So barriers, which is really interesting. Environmental access. So physical, again, I'm really focusing this on neurodivergent prisoners, because if I was to get into the whole thing, we really would be here all day. So physical environment was an issue across impairment types. So if you had a physical disability, there were issues there for you. But actually, in terms of like the actual sensory environment that prisoners found themselves in, were particularly problematic. And this has been identified by Claire and the team at NAS on a number of reports, that actually prison itself, things like noise, lights, chemical smell, we don't have slopping out in Irish prisons anymore, but actually they all smell like borax, which is just uncomfortable. Time is one thing. We were curious to find out how time was displayed. Time isn't displayed in a number of Irish prisons because it seemed to be a security risk. And when we found that out, there was obviously another 40 million questions to do. But for people who really like structure, really like time, who use that as a way to kind of provide stability in their life, like not having access to time and constantly having to ask an officer what time it is, would be like hugely frustrating. To be honest, I found it a long day, the first day we had to go without it. And basically we found that prisoners were very much at risk of both over and under stimulation, and experienced that. This is a quote from the prisoners: when they slammed the door at 7 o'clock, that's it, you were in there until the next morning. And a lot of people felt that there was a real emotional toll even from that over and under stimulation. Access to information, a huge amount of information wasn't written down. When it was written down, prison staff were incredibly conscious of literacy rates and issues around literacy rates, but not necessarily, and while things were written in plain language, that wasn't enough to necessarily articulate everything for people who had more significant literacy difficulties. Because we are a legal research centre that deals a lot with disability and people with intellectual disabilities and all sorts of disabilities, we would always have easy read materials with photographs very simplified down. And actually there were one or two prisoners who were like, I want that. Why? And we're pointing at our consent forms and our information sheets, being like, how can I get that information with pictures, which I thought was excellent self-advocacy. And these are some more quotes from prisoners. We couldn't find easy read materials in any of the prisons we visited. He said, I try and make up my own meaning of it. To be honest, I was too embarrassed to ask anyone else. For my situation, I left school at an early age and I never got to learn how to eat and write, read and write. And that's something that's kind of come out, that there's huge structural disadvantage, that a lot of the times people who are in prison have missed out at kind of every stage. I know there was one person we interviewed who had an intellectual disability, and when he walked into the room, it was quite clear he had an intellectual disability. He was in his early 20s. And we found out when talking to staff later, he had actually only been diagnosed the previous week, which is, again, something that's quite common, but also shocking, given that we've had, I suppose, early interventions in schools for quite a while in Ireland. But people kind of fall through the cracks at all edges of the system. Communication accessibility was a huge issue. It was seen as both making it difficult for people to navigate the prison system, but also exacerbated tensions and created different barriers for people. This is a quote from one person we interviewed who was talking about the difficulty he had in engaging with prison officers given his short-term memory issues. Where he was, my short-term memory is shot. You see the way I'm speaking to you now. I'm telling you something, a lot of things I said, it would be in my head somewhere, but it would come back to me, and that's a big problem, especially when I'm talking to, as I call them, not my language, the screws. I keep falling out with them because they tell me to do something, I keep forgetting to do things, but they don't understand the problem I have because we're all just the same to them because we're in prison. And that was something that was kind of seen across it. There was like, a failure to understand kind of the invisible disabilities and that they were at a greater disadvantage because of it. And then one public servant that we spoke to said it could be communication issues that aren't fully, I suppose, addressed. It could end up frustrating a situation for both prisoner and prison officers. That sometimes can be an aggressive outburst purely down to the frustration of the prisoner concerned not being able to communicate appropriately. And this was something that was kind of raised again and again, that something that in maybe a non-penal setting would be something that you would be kind of aware of how to address in a penal setting becomes something that just goes from kind of bad to worse. Because obviously, like, the way you respond to a prisoner is different to how you would respond to someone that you were seeing as a client or a patient. So that's one thing that came up repeatedly. There was, we were looking at this again from a human rights perspective, and we were asking people, we were kind of, I suppose, checking on people's rights literacy. There was a very minimal understanding of rights versus regime. There was a few people who were like, yeah, I'd like to know more about my rights. But for a lot of people we spoke to, they completely conflated regime and rights. So it was like, oh, my rights are this because we have an incentivized regime, which I'll explain in a minute. My rights are what I get in relation to my behaviour, rather than people understanding that they had like basic fundamental rights as humans. And while when you're in prison, your right to liberty is restricted, and that is something that we're doing, there are other rights that you still hold and will continue to hold. There was also no understanding of rights in terms of disability, and I think that's kind of a problem across. We talk about special needs in Ireland a lot, and I think a lot of the time what people are actually requiring for access and reasonable accommodation and are required for accessibility purposes are seen as special treatment, and therefore that doesn't translate well into prison. But also, even if we look at our own education system, when someone getting a reasonable accommodation is seen as a special thing, it's very difficult for those people to then continue to see themselves as rights holders and advocate for themselves. And we found there were some prisoners who were very well able to advocate for themselves in very limited settings, but they were generally prisoners who had already had supports and had access to supports and education. Rules, discipline and regime, lots of confusion around the rules. Prisons do make an attempt to convey the rules. Some have like a television station, some provide a book, but most prisoners were talking about learning them as they go along, and I'm not going to read out those quotes because I'm going to try and get everyone, make sure everyone gets fed. But as you can see, that like prisoners were quite confused as to the rules, which then led on to some issues around the regime. So in Ireland, we have an incentivized regime, which prison staff overwhelmingly accepted as like being a very good thing, and I think it probably is, except for prisoners who are maybe marginalised, who might struggle to go through it better. So we have 3 levels, okay? You've got basic, standard and enhanced, and your entitlements, so like your phone calls, your communication, your gratuity, are very much dependent on what level that you're on. And that your entitlements and how you are treated within the prison will be dependent on where you are placed within that regime, which is great, except for the fact that prisons mightn't necessarily be well equipped to measure the behaviour of neurodiverse prisoners or prisoners with disabilities. Firstly, actually, I should say that there was a huge, particularly for prisoners with ID or acquired brain injury, there was a huge confusion as to what would actually be required for them to actually like do well and get onto that enhanced level. There was one guy who was like, you have to do 5 subjects in the school, you have to go to the gym every single day for 8 weeks. He was like, definitely beyond me. He was someone who, with the right support, could have definitely managed to get onto the enhanced regime, but that support wasn't there and he wasn't sure what was being asked of him in the first place. Prisoners, and this was a neurodiverse prisoner who was talking about getting some acceptable weeks, some unacceptable weeks, and struggling to navigate that as well. But again, when we actually talked to this particular prisoner and it came down to certain behaviours being misinterpreted or certain supports not being there or them struggling with prison environment. One thing that was particularly upsetting and particularly infuriating was that when prisoners weren't able to access services or weren't able to engage meaningfully with services, they weren't getting the good behaviour marks that were coming with it. So this is one prisoner who wasn't actually neurodiverse. This was they had a different disability, but couldn't understand why having had good behaviour and having not being in trouble wasn't being moved up to the enhanced level. But it was because they weren't getting the positive engagement points that you needed to get to the enhanced level. This particular prisoner couldn't hear, going to the school wasn't an option, engaging with any of the programmes weren't an option, but still weren't being moved up in spite of not having any negative marks on their on their behavioural record. So were being effectively punishment for not engaging with services that weren't accessible to them in the first place. It was very mad. So non-discrimination in prison services, again, when we said that people didn't see themselves as rights holders and couldn't conceptualise themselves as rights holders, it was very difficult for them to actually engage with, or not, I suppose, advocate for themselves within those prison services. So within schools, we had a lot of people who really struggled with the school. The school environment could be really noisy. The stuff that was quieter was often prisoner-led, which maybe wasn't appropriate. So that's just some quotes and actually all of this. It was really funny. Well, it wasn't really funny, but prisoners were very aware often of where other disabled prisoners were being discriminated against, and were like, "Wait till I tell you what I saw last week," which was which was an interesting solidarity that was there. I know that Claire was talking earlier about people when there was actually proper supports weren't wasting time in prison, but in terms of the Irish system, a lot of prisoners weren't engaging with even the most basic services, never mind specialised services. And the schools are incredibly under-resourced. I can't emphasise enough how under-resourced the education facilities are in Irish prisons. But if you have a disability, you're not going. That disadvantage is multiplied, because obviously the 5 people in the room who are non-disabled are easier to teach within a traditional framework. So they're the ones who will get the attention. Access to employment. People really wanted jobs, and a lot of the people we were talking to were not able to access jobs. And a lot of them couldn't. Were like, I'd like to do cleaning, or I'd like to do something just to occupy time. Because ultimately, what we penalise you with in prison is your loss of liberty and taking time out of your life, and not being able to pass that time and being left in your cell. The isolation of that was very difficult. We had a lot of people who were like, well, I'd like to do this, but I can't understand. I'd like to do this, but they won't do that for me because I have a disability, and I can't be in a kitchen. I was like, you can't be in a kitchen, but maybe you could be somewhere else. And I think a little creativity in terms of reasonable accommodation is required in every workplace that has disabled people. That's part of the deal, and it just wasn't reflected. And I think when employment in those prison services are so crucial in terms of rehabilitation, and I know John talked earlier about that and the rehabilitative nature. People being excluded from that was particularly problematic. 2 more minutes, I'm almost there. So prisoner support. One of the things, and that's actually a quote specifically about kind of a prison staff and another prisoner working together to try and support a neurodivergent prisoner to go into his cell when he really didn't want it. That prisoner was ultimately transferred. Prisoners were providing an incredible amount of support for other prisoners right across the spectrum, from cleaning each other's cells. There was one instance where a prisoner actually had to help in, we're helping in emergencies. There was one instance where a prisoner described doing some very intimate personal care help. Prisoners who just transcribed entire classes for other prisoners, and there was a huge amount of that. And there was also a huge amount of staff who really went out of their way to try and figure out things that they could do, but ultimately were facing a resource battle that made things very difficult. Diversion was a concern, particularly from stakeholders, that a lot of people were being diverted without necessarily the due process. Diversion is basically considered non-compliant with the CRPD because of the dangers of people having their prison stays extended through other means, because of forced treatment, because of different practices. But I'm not going to get into that because that would be another 20 minutes. Transition from prison. So all of the barriers that we talked about, all of the issues there became huge issues around when it came to actually people leaving. People weren't able to access open prisons because of a lack of supports. People weren't seen to have engaged with the programs. They weren't on that enhanced. They didn't have that positive engagement points. So when it came to things like parole, community release, and step down temporary release, they seemed to be less likely to get it. And that was kind of reported across stakeholders and from prisoners themselves. We talked about people seeming, how people were perceived because of their disabilities if they're not making eye contact, particularly around neurodiverse prisoners. Like, that's a huge issue if it comes up for a parole board. And also if you're in an accessible place and you're dealing with this environment that isn't suited to you, like, chances are you won't have gone through prison smoothly. There will have been instances of behaviour. So that was quite bad. Transition from prison was also an issue, and it was something that, like, prisoners themselves really identified. There was a huge amount of concern around housing, which was quite heartbreaking. A lot of people were expecting to go back into homelessness, even with we've a much better sentence management structure than we previously did. But people were also just really conscious that they weren't going to get the supports they needed, that they weren't, if they hadn't previous contact with the HSE, they weren't going to be able to get back in, they weren't going to be able to manage their medication, and also the change of structure. Like, changes in structure, like, if you notice, like, you guys are a lot of you would be professionals in neurodiversity. Transitions are considered really key times, like from schools into adulthood. From prison is just as big a transition, even more, because you're dealing with the institutionalization, and that's something that's just been addressed a few times. Okay, I'm going to leave it there because it did go to 20 minutes. I'm very sorry. We have the project outputs. It's going to be launched in January. Thank you very much.